Ledger is a writing podcast and one that is hopefully helping you find a metaphor that works for you. I'm your host, Austin Wilson. Welcome to the show. Today I am chatting with author, editor, mentor, all kinds of things, Glenn Stout. I know Glenn because he was the series editor for Best American Sports Writing, a collection that ran from 1991 to 2020 and then spawned the newest, the year's Best Sports Writing, which Glenn has been helping out with. We talk about that and so much more. He's got a book called Tiger Girl and the Candy Kid, America's original gangster couple, which was on the New York Times and Boston Globe bestseller list. He wrote a book called The Young Woman in the Sea about Trudy Ederle, the first woman to ever swim the English Channel. And that has been adapted into a film starring Daisy Ridley. And as of recording, it is not on Disney Plus yet, but it should be coming soon. So keep checking for that. Based on his book, it is an amazing story. Man, I love talking to Glenn. There was a lot of awesome stuff we covered. We talked about style within narrative nonfiction, something that he knows a lot about as he's written a ton, edited a ton, consulted on a ton, taught about it, a lot of that stuff. We talk about sports writing and whether or not we are reading sports as another way to interact with the hero's journey, and his teaching at Archer City, which he is doing again this year, 2024, September 25th through the 29th. And we also get to the big questions like, hey, does writer's block even exist? Some people say no, some people say yes, so see what Glenn has to say about it. So swing by glennstout.com, check out all of his work, and Google him, like he says. You can find a ton of stuff. There are a lot of great stories out there that Glenn has had a hand in, either selecting or editing or writing himself, so make sure you seek some of that stuff out. Even if you don't like sports, we talk about that in the show too. Sports as just being kind of the through line that lets you get into the things that you actually are there to read about, humanity, the common experience of us all. So I think there's a lot of awesome stuff for you to read, even if you're not a sports fan. As always, check out my stuff. Go to austinrwilson.com. You can have links there for 3 volumes of my current story, Dynasty of Blood. It's an ongoing prose serialized story set in a fictional 1980s and is about a tabletop game called Dynasty of Blood that I am currently in the middle of writing the setting for and building all kinds of stuff for that around a system called Shadow Dark. You'll see a lot more of that stuff coming soon, but there are 3 volumes up right now, so check that out at austinrwilson.com. Always, please subscribe, like, leave reviews, ratings, tell people about the show. It really, really helps. I appreciate everyone who swings by to listen. But as for now, here is my conversation with Glenn Stout. So probably not surprising to you, I found my way to your work through Best American Sports Writing, which you're the series editor for from 1991 through 2020, which is the entire run of the series, almost 30 years. I'm sure you've talked about this before a bajillion times, but to help my listeners understand the difference between a series editor and someone who's editing individual pieces, can you kind of talk to me what it was like being the series editor, especially for a series as influential and massive as Best American Sports Writing?
Well, as series editor, I was more responsible for the logistics of the series rather than the actual selections. What I would do was I would survey as much material on my own as I could. I would receive submissions from editors, publications, and individual writers. And I would forward at the end of the process, when it was time for selections, about 75 of those to the actual guest editor, who changed every year, who would make the final selections. They were not confined to those 75 stories or 4 I put forward. They were encouraged to make their own selections that were certainly free to outside of those 75. But, my role as series editor was to make their job easier. So by pre-screening some stories, it moved things along that way, because it would be very difficult to, believe me, to get a guest editor to agree to do the kind of reading I would do as series editor.
So you're reading every piece?
Well, I tell people I would read every piece until it got to the point where I didn't have to read any farther. And often that would be within a couple of paragraphs, because I had to look at it like a reader. And if I get 1 or 2 paragraphs in and I'm not hooked, I have to think like a reader opening up the book. Is this story going to hook you? If it doesn't, after a couple of graphs, I'm done. If I like those first couple of graphs, I'd read the ending. If I like the ending and I like the beginning, I'd probably read the rest of it. And, at the end of the year, there would be an enormous pile of stories that I didn't like and a much smaller pile of stories that I did like. And then I go through those again and pass those forward to the guest editor.
Right. And that might sound shocking to some of the listeners. I know previously I had brief experience reading screenplays for Austin Film Festival in Texas. And after screenplays reached a certain point in the process, you do get to that point where it's like, okay, if you're reading a screenplay to say no, like this isn't going to go any further, you have to conserve time because there's a bajillion screenplays. And often when you are trying to whittle, you do get to the point where you're like, okay, I know this isn't at the level that it needs to be. I can move forward from it.
Yeah, it's a fire hose, and you have to manage the fire, right? And at the same token, there were sometimes I would come across a story that that within the first graph or two, I just said, "This is so good, I'm going to save that till the very end, so I can read it then and see if it continues to be so good." And one story I'll mention that was like that was J.R. Moringer's Resurrecting the Champ, which I read the first lead. It's got this really long lead that breaks all the rules. And I was like, I'm not reading this till the end. In fact, I actually didn't ever read it until the book came out. I put it forward sight unseen because I was just blown away by the lead. And fortunately, it was actually really, really, really good, and made the book. And then when I got the book, it was like, great, now I can finally read this terrific story.
So where was that in terms of like his career? For listeners, if you don't know, he wrote a book called The Tinder Bar. He's done a lot of ghostwriting, somewhat publicly here recently.
Yeah, he was known as a very talented writer before, but I think this predated The Tinder Bar. So he was just, this is from I think the LA Times magazine is where the story first ran, but it was just, sometimes you can just tell.
Yeah, it's good writing, which we're going to get back to as far as, recognizing good writing. Good writing stands up and you can recognize it pretty quickly. So did any of that include line editing or
no, not
editing
at all.
For clarity? None of it?
No, everything ran as originally printed. But I think along the way, I developed a pretty good sense of taste. It certainly helped my own writing. And later when I did do editing, it's certainly, which I continue to do now on a freelance basis for people, it certainly informs me, every day. I think it gave me a really good sense of what works and what doesn't.
So I had this planned for later, but I think it pops up a little bit easier now because you've been writing professionally. You started out, your website lists, you did some freelance work in the 80s, and then you've never been without an assignment since.
Right.
But you ended up becoming a professional freelancer in the early 90s as a writer. When did you know, or maybe suspect, I guess is the better word, that you were an editor?
Good question. Along the way, I would have friends ask me to look at things. Okay. And they always seem to enjoy the feedback, appreciate the feedback. And then the other part of it was that as a writer, I never felt like I was actually adequately edited. And often I was never edited at all. Or when I was, I didn't like the way it was done. It was done either very cursory or very dismissive or just wasn't done the right way. So when I would approach work for people, I decided I would do it the way I thought it should be done, which is, very comprehensively, very deeply, very respectfully. I trust the writer. I want to hear what the writer has to say. I don't want every piece to sound the same. And that's the bane of commercial writing, is that so much of it ends up sounding exactly the same. And so when I got into editing, I wouldn't force people to write like everybody else. I would trust them a little bit more. And that's something I continue to do to this day. I take on freelance work for, individuals and outlets for, mostly nonfiction, but also some fiction, memoirs, narrative nonfiction, all sorts of things. I'm working on like 3 different projects right now with writers and outlets.
So that's a good transition to talk about style. I really like thinking about how writers deal with their own styles. And, coming across work online, or whether it's a compilation or wherever you're coming across, if it's narrative nonfiction, my experience has that you can kind of see the template. I've read probably enough of it to see the template. Maybe it's not easy for everyone, but if you read enough, you start to see like, okay, here's your intro paragraph, and you're going to loop back around to this. And I wanted to talk about developing styles within narrative nonfiction. And I know you've taught at Archer City with Jackie Bonashinsky and Kim Cross. And
I'm going back there this September.
are you? That's awesome.
Yeah,
That's
I'm going
awesome.
back there this September to teach again, so that'll be great fun.
How would you teach around style? Is that something you even worry about? Is it?
Yeah, well, I do. I mean, I think I don't want everything to sound the same. I want you to know kind of who wrote it. There's a distinctive writer here. And to that end, um, I'll let things be a little loosey goosey. And I try to get the writers to discover what kind of writer they are. Hey, personally, one of my favorite writers is Jack Kerouac. He does cartwheels on the page, always did. It took me a long time to realize that I can't do cartwheels on the page. I'm not that coordinated, you know. But over time, I discovered that as attractive as that is, and if you can do that kind of writing, great. I just got done working with a writer who does that kind of writing, and she's fabulous. But at the same time, writing which uses no less craft sometimes is writing that stays behind the story, writing that you don't even notice, writing that allows the story to come into the forefront so you're not even really aware that you're reading. It's utterly immersive. I liken it to the metaphor of you're walking into water that's body temperature, and you don't even know that the water's coming up over your mouth and then up to your nose because you're just so immersed in it. That takes a lot of craft too. And so what is style there? Well, I was brought up as a writer, as a poet originally, and I'll never forget this, something I learned from a poet by the name of Jack Spicer. And he said that the perfect poem has an infinitely small vocabulary. And by that, he meant that every single word is precisely the correct word in that place at that time. I think the same is really true for prose. If you want that immersive experience, you don't want the reader to jump out of a story because you've used the wrong word, or you've used an awkward phrase, or you've used a $2 word when a 50-cent word was more appropriate, or vice versa. Um, and I think the way you do that is to be sensitive to sound. Again, my background came through poetry. I think words have sound and sense and rhythm. They all work together. If you get the sound right, so you're not taken out of the story, if you get the sound right, I think that's what helps penetrate into the reader's mind and allows them to reach for that immersive experience. So by the time you get to the end of the story, you're a little bit transformed. You've been changed in a way, either large or small, but you've been changed. And that comes by style. What disturbs me about an awful lot of narrative nonfiction I read today is the reporting is fabulous, the subjects are great, um, the organization is fine, and the writing is deadly. It doesn't have a sense of sound. It doesn't have a sense of pace, and the language is all over the place. And those just kick me out right away. I think, particularly now that so many people read off electronic devices, and it's easy to stop and Google something, you got to be sensitive to that. You don't want them to stop. Uh, so that's what I do. And how do you get the writer's style? You listen to how they write, and you point out to them what works and why it works and what doesn't. And you talk about the question that nobody ever talks about: why'd you pick that word? I mean, you can go to workshops and people talk all day long about reporting, and they'll talk all day long about structure, and they'll never say, why'd you use that word? I try to ask that question: why'd you use that word? And is that the right word? And if it's not, here's why. Let's read this aloud and see how it sticks out, how you stumble over it. Because if you're stumbling over it when you're speaking your own words, a reader reading it, even silently, is going to go, huh?
So do you think everything, and this is a question that's come up multiple times on the show, do you think everything should be read aloud at some point? Not necessarily like the like representation of it, but like in the process of reading it, should a writer be reading it out loud, even if it's narrative nonfiction? People talk about doing that with dialogue, obviously, for fiction, but
It really, really, really helps if you read it aloud. I mean, I had a teacher years ago doing poetry, and he said, read everything aloud and listen to it back. He says, and look out for two things. One, listen to where you stumble over a word, because if you stumble over your own words when you're reading them, you probably used the wrong one. And two, when you're listening back to your own words, see where you start to drift off. Because if you start to drift off and you've written it, guess where the reader is? The reader is way off the page. They've left a long time ago. Uh, I don't think you necessarily at a certain point have to read everything out loud, but you have to train yourself to hear when you read. I'm a notoriously slow reader because I hear every word. That's my bad training. I used to be a much faster reader, but now I hear every word, and still sometimes we'll speak things aloud. We'll read things aloud just so I can, you know, tune up my, work that muscle again.
so well, there you said a couple things right there that I kind of want to dig down into, specifically immersion. It's funny because when I think about reading and writing fiction, I often think about immersion and the flow of a story and not wanting to be taken out of it. But I don't often associate that, and this is just me personally, with reading narrative nonfiction for some reason. Potentially, I am subconsciously thinking about it or doing it, and those things you spoke of, bringing readers out of stories, or causing that little jog in the reading experience. I was curious about whether or not having a writer who foregrounds themselves in narrative nonfiction is not necessarily wrong, because I think people can make it work, just depending on how the writer is. But the reason I'm asking this is because in the Best American Sports Writing of the Century, which is a collection of a bunch of great stories from that entire series, the first piece is by Gay Talese, and it is probably one of the best narrative nonfiction stories that I've ever read. And it seems like it wasn't written by a person. Like, Gay Talese doesn't necessarily exist in the story. And I was curious about your opinion about reading or editing even pieces where it seems like it is about the writer writing. Like, the story is about me, the writer, writing the story.
Yeah, you get a lot of that now, in particular, I think, because of two things. Because of one, so much online writing is personal based, and also the influence of podcasts, where podcasts are not so much about the story, they're about the reporting of the story.
Right.
They're taking the end of the story and making it the story, how you got there, making that the entire story. So I think it's really influenced by that now. Um, so I try to kind of back away from that. Um, in narrative nonfiction, you don't necessarily have to try to work with a lot of style, but I think what you really have to do is you got to read a lot of different things. You have to read fiction, you have to read poetry, you have to read all these different things, and let all that work its way into your toolbox, right? Hey, if you're a guitar player, you're not just listening to somebody playing a guitar. You're listening to all sorts of music. You're doing scales, you're doing everything, and then you're playing guitar. When you're writing even narrative nonfiction, if you've read widely and listened widely, and that includes even listening to music and getting involved in other arts, and just you're working all those different muscles, so that when you sit down, you're not just a one trick pony. You're not just someone that can write a standard news feature. And when I say that, everybody knows what I mean, what a standard news feature is. You've read them a million times. And maybe because you read them a million times, that's why not many people are reading them anymore, or as much as they used to. Because I am concerned about the future of narrative nonfiction. I think in a lot of ways, over the last decade or so, we've lost a generation of readers because not as much is being produced. The outlets aren't there. The space isn't there. There are more stories than ever waiting to be told. There are as many writers as ever waiting to tell them, but readers have not been trained to read and appreciate them in the way they once were.
I'm glad we got here because I spent so much time trying to figure out how to ask this question, because I'm also concerned for the lack of narrative nonfiction. And there are certain writers out there who are doing it great. Realistically, the things that I encounter the most are profile pieces more than anything, where it seems adjacent to narrative nonfiction, not necessarily the same kind of thing. And I was curious specifically about sports writing, but not necessarily just that. Like, that's the thing that leaps to mind immediately, obviously. But seeing so many publications close down and layoffs, and I was curious. Well, one, the way that I ended up getting to sort of around the question is, where do you specifically go to read great sports writing that's narrative nonfiction, or even not just narrative nonfiction? But I do want to talk about maybe the trends or the failures that have led to the sort of dearth of this great style of writing that.
Yeah, I don't think there's a particular place that I go to anymore to read great sports writing or even to read great writing.
Yeah.
Once upon a time, you could go to some of the legacy publications. You knew GQ was going to have two or three pieces a year that were going to be great, and Esquire was, and some of the big newspaper magazines and all that stuff. I mean, it's hard to believe, but you go back 20, 25 years, there were more than 100 Sunday supplement magazines, which were always great places to write. One of the first places I wrote, and those are all gone with a handful of exceptions. So there's no single place to go anymore. There's no standalone websites, really, I think, that produce high quality work. I mean, there's websites that produce a lot of work. Good luck finding the good stuff, because it's really, really hard. And there's not even the forums now, like in the old days of Twitter, where people are sharing, oh, this is a great story. And all of a sudden it's being shared by hundreds and hundreds of people. That doesn't happen anymore either. So because you can't find it, it's not being done. Because it's not being done, you can't find it. And I always think back to 10, 15 years ago, I would hear all the time from young writers, people in school, college kids. They wanted to be long form feature writers. That's what they wanted to be. They wanted to be Wright Thompson. They wanted to be, somebody like that. I think I've gotten one call like that in the last 7 or 8 years. And I
Yeah.
still speak to classes occasionally, and they want to do podcasts. They want to have a platform. They want to do video. They still kind of like writing, but, they don't want to read anything really long, and, even as a book author myself, I have, written a number of books which are kind of straightforward, standard narrative nonfiction accounts. Tiger Girl and the Candy Kid, which is about gangsters in the 1920s, or Young Woman in the Sea, about the first woman to swim the English Channel. And those are told in kind of, straightforward narrative nonfiction ways. They're very research heavy. They're very detailed and everything. And some people encounter those today, and they're like, well, one, it's so long, and where's all the dialogue? Because they think everything should have dialogue. Well, it did happen 100 years ago. There's no microphones then.
Right.
And that's what I talk about, where we haven't trained. We've lost a generation of readers that just have not grown up reading that stuff like I did. I was the kid that went to the library and read the old Best Short Stories collection that was done for 40 some odd years, or the old Fireside collections. I was that kid. I don't know, maybe they still read the Best American Sports Writing, or its new iteration, the year's Best Sports Writing. I hope so. Some do. But, in the long run, the one thing you can say about this entire business is that it's always changed, and it always will. It's
Yep.
never stayed the same. This is kind of part of that continuum. I hope it's not the end of the continuum.
I hope so too. And I mean, it's looking more and more like I was the generation right on the cusp of all of that stuff changing. I just turned 40 this year, and I did all of those same things you did. I went to the library, and the internet didn't really become a thing until I was in my teens, at least not to the point that I
Right.
could interact with it. And even then, it hadn't become anything near what it is now. And I love narrative nonfiction and still, seek it out, but I'm a 40-year-old. So,
Yeah, I mean it's true, and the sad thing is like I know a number of writers who are about your age, right? Who should be really in the apex of their careers, really charged. They've done great work before, and they're bartending, they're doing landscaping, they're still writing when they can, but they should be at the apex of their careers, and I knock on wood. I'm like, my God, I'm getting out at just under the wire because I survived as a freelancer for over 30 years, which, is like telling somebody, that I used the telegraph, or that I,
right.
or that I had to write things down before I typed them, which I did when I started, you know, uh,
Right.
you know, it's like you're talking a whole different generation. But, the one thing I think you can say is there's always exceptions, and there are always writers who are going to be incredibly inventive and come up with things that are just astonishingly good. Jeremy Collins, a wonderful writer, just wrote a piece in Esquire Online that's about Larry Bird that is just like drop dead astonishing. It's not about
I'm going
Bird
to
per
look that
se,
up.
but it's about growing up in Indiana with the and birds kind of in the atmosphere. And Jeremy's a wonderful writer. If you haven't read his stuff, boy, he's about as good as it gets. But
I will
he's
seek
like
it
a
out.
teacher full time. He doesn't like write full time. He
Yeah,
should.
that's another thing. Well, I love that aspect of the conversation, particularly because I live it too, and I grew up with those dreams of I'm going to be a writer.
Yeah.
And the older I got, the more I realized that looks different than what I thought when I was younger. And the concept of writing full time means something different to me now as a 40-year-old than it did as a 20-year-old. But I'm curious about, and I tend to sort of bundle these questions at the end, but we can jump into some of them now, about writing every single day. And I've seen in some of your bios, you did all these different jobs. I think you took tickets, or you were
Sold tickets over the phone for a minor league baseball team in Columbus, Ohio.
sold tickets. So, right. Yeah.
Poured
So
concrete.
what,
It's all sorts of stuff.
so what's a writer's life mean to you now versus maybe 80s and 90s?
Well, when I was much younger, even before I was starting to write, I thought writing, I grew up in central Ohio, you know, I thought writing was something done by other people. It was unimaginable, okay, for me at the time. But, then I got hooked and started doing it. And like, lo and behold, you start knowing writers, you start doing things. And then, I kind of jumped in accidentally to the whole prose thing and making money. Just, I was working at the Boston Public Library and stumbled across some stories and didn't even think about it for a while. I just, when I decided to go full time freelance, I cashed in my retirement and said, well, I'll give it 6 months. If it doesn't work, I'll get another job at a library. Um, which I'd never even think about today. I would just have that
Right.
audaciousness of being young and, I'll figure it out. But, it, as I've gotten older, I've kind of realized, on the one hand, how special it is to be able to do this. I mean, we're really lucky. But at the other time, it's just like doing anything else. It's not this precious thing. You, I wrote somewhere, you're a day laborer if you're doing this. Um, you're doing it every day. It's the old with the old Earl Weaver quote. This ain't football. We do this every day. You know, you play baseball every day and not football once a week, and that's what writing is. You're at it every day, and it has to be. I think the real key is you normalize it in your life. And I tell a lot of writers, and I don't think this really happened to me until I was in my 40s, where I got to the point where when I sat down to write, I was no longer going, flexing my fingers and going, and now I'm writing. And you kind of become this other persona, and you're trying to do things that, you're pretending to be a writer. You're acting like a writer. And sometimes you actually end up writing when you're doing that. That's not unimportant. But it really wasn't until I got into my probably 40s that I realized that I broke down that barrier. And that's a real important barrier to break down because, once you realize it's not so precious, once you don't have to do that big preamble before you get going, then it's much easier to sustain. And let me turn this off. It's much easier to sustain what you're working on, to continue it, to move back and forth between projects. My wife is a big knitter, and I'll see her knitting, and then she'll be tearing it all out. I'm like, how can you do that? She says, well, it's all knitting. Well, it's all writing, whether I'm editing someone, whether I'm writing something myself, whether I'm, tearing up what I just did or, erasing it and going back. It's all 26 letters in different order.
It's funny. On my first date with who would become my wife, I taught her how to knit. And that is one of the fun parts about it is tearing it all out, which they call frogging it. And it's fun to start over. You get to a point where you're like, it's not going how it should.
Yeah, well, it's like when I write something, I'm like, it's never going to be perfect at the beginning. And I tell writers, just get it on the page. Give us something to work with. I don't care what it is. It doesn't have to be good, doesn't have to be great. Just get the words there. Now you got some words there. Now we can do something with them.
It took me so much longer than I wish it would have to get to that point.
Yeah.
But obviously that was, I went through the things I had to go through to get to that point. But the idea of like, hey, I'm going to build this thing day by day, and it's not going to be the same thing at the end of it. What I end up building will not look like what it looks like now.
That's hugely important. I'm so glad you brought that up. I always share with a lot of writers a poem by Frank O'Hara called Oranges. And it's about a painter who starts a painting about one thing. And essentially it ends up being an entirely different thing, but it's still got the same title at the start, which is Oranges, even though there's no orange in it. I think a lot of writers get so hung up with structure. Here's my structure. Here's the story I'm going to write. And by God, I'm going to fit it into this structure I've decided on, whether it fits or not. I like to argue for a much more organic story structure. The story is there. It will tell you how it wants to be written. And if you kind of let that happen, rather than try to fix it into a form, you end up with a much better story. And I tell people, even with my books, I say, you want to see an outline of a book? Let me look at the proposal and see what it said, because I haven't looked at it since. And literally, once I start, the structure starts to show itself. And I've been stunned sometimes to go back and look at my book proposals and say, didn't write that book. I wrote another one, better one, I think, but I didn't write the one I set out to write.
And I feel like, so there's a a filmmaker, and he's a writer and actor too, named Mark Duplass. And he talks about that same thing about he calls it a vomit draft. I think other people have obviously called it that too, but like just getting it out. And for him, he says he does his vomit drafts in audio. He'll just talk through the whole thing, and your body, he says, knows how a film should be structured because you've watched films. And right. I started thinking more and more about that, about books, and whether it's narrative nonfiction or fiction or whatever it is, like if you are doing the thing you're talking about earlier and you're consuming and you're reading widely, you end up sort of internalizing things you might not even realize you are, where then when you start planning, there's that part of your brain that's like, this thing that you wrote doesn't feel like where it should go.
Yeah. I had a great experience with a young writer once who was struggling to go from writing those standard news features. He wanted to do, the ones you could get $1 a word for. And he was trying to, the real struggle. And I said, well, here's what you do. I said, take a story, I said, that maybe is in some ways similar to the one you write. And I said, I want you to do exactly what this writer does structurally for the first 5 or 6 paragraphs. If they start with one line of dialogue, you start with one line of dialogue. If they then go into description, you do that. If they then do, an expository paragraph, you do that. And I just wanted to see the interactions between those 3 elements. And not only did he do that, but he did it, he typed out the original story and then like his version. And as I told him, like each paragraph by paragraph, and I told him, at a certain point, you're going to diverge because your story's different. And he did. But that cracked the code for him. He understood how those parts related. And all of a sudden, he could write a 3,000 or 4,000 word story. Now, what he was doing wasn't plagiarizing. He was really like using someone else's structure to get into a place where he could continue. And I think that's a great thing to do. You've just got to be in the place with it. There's a great metaphor I like, and it's in Moby Dick, where they spend what they call as a season on the line. And when you're in whaling, they'd go out in the ocean and they'd spend a season on a line. And the line was this place where they knew the whales were going to be, okay, through experience. As writers, you got to put yourself on the line where you know the story's going to be, and you've got to be open to following it when it passes you by and chasing it down. And that doesn't always go the same direction, and you don't always catch it in the same way, right? But you got to be in that
I like
place
that.
where you can, see that spout coming up and chase after it.
Right. I like that. Yeah, I think that's apt. Speaking of that and the toolbox sort of stuff, and someone that I like who does write longer pieces, usually profiles, although she has 2 novels out now. As I was preparing for this interview, I was reading, all kinds of stuff, and I came across a quote about writer's block. I go to the website LitHub a lot, and Taffy Brodesser Ackner was talking about writer's block. And she said this quote, and I was like, damn, that's good. She said, we like to think of writing as spiritual, but actually it's just physics. And the concept of writer's block for me is one of those like sort of non-corporeal like boogeymen. I was curious about your take on writer's block. And
never really had it, I have to say,
yeah,
because, I've done a lot of stuff and I've always had more stuff to do. So if I'm sitting down and the writing isn't working, well, there's something to read or there's something to research.
yeah,
Or one thing I always tell writers is when I go back and forth, like if I'm writing a book and I stopped writing this afternoon, when I go back to it tomorrow morning, I'm going to back up 500 or 1,000 words, edit forward into the place where I stopped, and then just keep going. Because by that time, I'm in the headspace. And, if a particular day the words aren't coming that I want, well, yeah, then I'll do research, I'll do edit, I'll go back and edit more. I'll, it's all knitting, right? There's other places
right.
to go with your energy with this, the writing brain is working all the time. You've got this hard drive, even when you're not thinking about writing, that's, it's working on you. I always tell people, when is it time to write a story? Well, it's time to write the story when you're doing something else and your brain starts writing it for you. And, I'm doing the dishes and all of a sudden my brain is not doing the dishes. My brain is telling me things about Trudy Ederle. That's time to write. You don't want to miss those moments. And, and she's right, it is physics. I say, what's the biggest lesson in writing? Ass in chair. Till you sit down, don't get that other cup of coffee. When I've been doing editing, I always had what I called the coffee cup test, because I'd get up and I'd start editing right away. And I'd tell writers, I say, I know it's pretty good if, I don't need another cup of coffee. I know it's really good if I don't finish a cup of coffee. I know it's great if I start working on it and I never even get to the coffee and it turns cold in the cup.
Yeah.
There's the test right there, right? I'm immersed at that point. So, but it is, it's get your ass in the chair. It is day labor. It's not just going to happen by magic. Sometimes it's magic. Sometimes it's art. It's great when it happens. It's, it'll happen a handful of times in your life where it just like takes off and you're just riding the wave. But most of the time, you're there struggling. You're trying to stay afloat, and you just got to keep going forward and trust in it. I mean, that's the other thing with younger writers or people starting out is you have to be confident and trust yourself that it's going to happen. And I think the one lesson of writing for a long time is that I know it's going to happen. I mean, when I was writing my last book, Tiger Girl and the Candy Kid, there was a scene that I'd been waiting to write for 15 years. And when I went to bed the night before I knew I was going to write it, I was so excited. And then I woke up at 2:30 in the morning and I was like, I got to go now. I got to go. And I mean, yeah, it's hard, but there's joy in it too. And you have to focus on that. And I was just thrilled. I think I sat down there for, I don't know, 8 or 9 hours. I don't even think I had coffee that day. Um, and just, I'd been waiting and I was ready. And I knew, because that hard drive is going, it was telling me I was ready. And I have faith that when I go down there, if I get stuck, I'll go down the next day. My brain, without thinking about it, will give me the solutions. This is this kind of stuff you just intuit by feel over a long period of time. And everybody's brain's a little different. That's just how mine works.
Yeah, and charting the like almost like the map of a written piece from its beginning to end is never going to look like a straight line.
Oh no,
It's it'll be a mess.
it's a spiral down usually.
Oh yeah. Well, so the sports writing, I definitely wanted to touch on that, specifically writing about sports. And there was this thing that I kept thinking of as I was reading some of your work, and specifically Young Woman in the Sea, which is, for listeners, it's about Trudy Ederle. She's the first woman to ever swim the English Channel. Which we're going to get to the Disney adaptation here in a second. I kept thinking about sports as like these like real life representations of the hero's journey. Even something as small as like coming up to bat, or taking a 3-pointer when the clock's almost down at zero. Like when you first started with sports writing, how were you interacting with it? Because in your great foreword to the big collection, the best sports writing of the century, you talk about how most, like, it's just good writing that happens to be about sports. But prior to a certain point in the early 20th century, it was kind of just rote recitation of facts, where it's like they scored this many points and then they won. When you interact with sports writing, is it in a way that is, do you think, connecting with this like other version of the hero's journey? Maybe not that specific, but
Well, I think it taps into something shared and collective. Okay. Sports puts borders on the larger world and tries to be this little microcosm. Okay. And because our Venn diagram with others often can cross on sports and not many other things, the weather probably is about the only other thing there. Um, that's why those stories have resonance. And that's why they
yeah.
communicate both to us as individuals and to us collectively as groups of people. Um, and, if there's any reason why we do this, I think it's because you don't know anyone until you start to share stories. Once you start to share, you meet a stranger, and hi, how are you? Blah, blah, blah. And then, did you see the game last night? Oh, and then you say, oh, yeah. And then this guy tells you a story about it. Maybe you tell a story about the kid. All of a sudden, you know each other. Through telling stories, we know each other. Sports just happens to be one of these places that overlap where it's really easy for people to know each other, to be in the same playing field, so to speak. And once you're in that door with people by sports, which I think is really interesting, once you get them in that door, you can write about anything else. You can write about power. You can write about sex. You can write about, prejudice. You can write about anything once you get in the door. And people will read and accept stories about subjects that they're really not interested in because there's a Green Bay Packer in the middle of it. Okay. So you can write about race. You can write about sexism and gender and all this stuff. But because it's about sports, and these are people that you would never read about any of these things, or collectively you may never have a conversation with, but you'll talk about that, you'll read that. And if the goal is not like to communicate through stories and know each other, then we're all just writing for ourselves. And why share it?
Yeah, why do that?
Why do it?
Why do that?
Yeah. Hey, you sat around the campfire and told stories, so your tribe got to know the other tribe. or the new person that was at your campfire that day.
Right. And it's funny you say that because I was reading the 2023 Best Sports Writing collection, and there's a story in there by Sean Williams about stone skipping.
Yeah.
And if anyone had asked me, Austin, what do you know about stone skipping? Nothing. Do you care about stone skipping? No. But I read that story, and literally after that story, I showed, I'm going to say 8 people, a video of one of the people Sean writes about skipping this stone. I was like, look how many times this dude skips this stone. And I was immediately hooked. There's all these human elements about battling cancer and the looming shadow of death and all of these things. And it's a story about skipping rocks ostensibly, but there's so much more going on that it stuck with me. And I've talked to multiple people about it since
Well,
then.
and that's one of those stories that exemplifies what I wanted to have happen in that book and in any collection or anything you write is you don't want somebody just to read it, put it down and say, "Oh, that was nice," and then go on.
Right.
You want them to read it and then go, "Hey, you got to read this." You want them to share it. You want them to talk to other people about it. That's been the goal of that book is stories you want to share with other people forever.
Oh, and well, I mean, you did a good job because the one right after that is about the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders. And that one's by Sarah Hepola. And another one that I just was like, holy shit, did you know this? And would like tell people about pieces of it and those kinds of things. The first time I ever encountered, I think I was pretty young. I remember ESPN used to do these. I mean, maybe they still do. What they do through the 30 for 30 thing.
Yeah.
But I saw this like sort of docudrama about it was literally, I think maybe just about the Bulls season where Michael Jordan played with the flu. And I remember there was one game where he had the flu. He had like 100-degree fever or something. And I remember watching this docudrama and seeing all of these things happening that if you're watching the game on ESPN, it just looks like Michael Jordan is like, he feels like shit. He's sweating a bunch. But then when you see all of these other things happening behind the scenes, he's struggling on the side of the court. And that was one of the things that really hooked me, that pushed me into seeking out sports writing and those stories that are happening almost like around the thing that everyone is there for.
Mm-hmm.
Man, they really can grab you.
Well, as Rick Tellender, who edited the collection one year, we met one time, and he said, and, Rick has been a longtime Chicago sports writer, former football player at Northwestern, wrote Heaven is a Playground, which is a classic book. He says, Glenn, let's face it. He says, we don't really care about sports. He says, we only care about what sports lets us write about. And I think that's pretty much sums it up. Because if you're writing just about sports, it doesn't go anywhere.
Right.
Okay. When they say stick to sports, you give anything but the score, you're not sticking with sports. You're going
right.
someplace else,
Right.
And, I find myself at 65 far less interested in sports than I've been in any point in my life. I hardly pay attention to, who wins or who loses or stuff anymore. I still read about it. But I'm into more interested in the larger issues it's taken me to. And one of which is, through the book is through writing and thinking about writing and teaching writing and all that stuff too. Again, that's a really confined ground to work in, sports, to teach what do you need to know in terms of writing.
Yeah. So sort of wrapping up, I've got 2 kind of bigger questions. The one of them is about Young Woman in the Sea,
Sure.
which is your book about Trudy Ederle, recently adapted into a movie starring Daisy Ridley. I would love to know your experience with the adaptation process and what you were involved with, what you weren't involved with, and also kind of just the experience of seeing all of your research and all of those days with your butt in the chair turning into something like that.
Well, unless you're a Stephen King or someone, once your property is optioned, you really don't have any influence on it. I would tell people this was optioned back in 2015. The book was published in 2009. I conceived of it in about 2001. So, long process here. And I told people after it was optioned, I said, they could turn her into a cartoon duck and have her swim across a mud puddle if they want to.
Right.
That's their right. Now, I got really lucky because Jeff Nathanson, the screenwriter who first optioned it, has kept me informed through the process throughout. Um, Queried me any number of times with questions. I'm talking hundreds and hundreds of times. I also knew going in that, there would necessarily be changes. Films are not books. Books are not films. I can't tell him how to write a film. He can't tell me how to write a book, and I wouldn't presume otherwise, right? But, so there are, changes from the book. There's a lot of changes from the book, but they're all intentional and purposeful. They're all to communicate something that has to be communicated, what you learn very quickly, what has to be communicated in a film, you might have to do it in 5 seconds, one scene, 10 seconds. That in a book might take 10 pages to explain. Or in a
Right.
book, you have 5 people who are misogynist, anti-women sports figures. Well, in a movie, you don't have time to introduce 5 characters. You can introduce maybe one. So
One.
people get combined and all that.
Yep.
He did share with me like the first iteration of the screenplay. And I will say, after going through this process, it's absolutely amazing that any movie ever gets made, because the screenplay has to go through a gauntlet of not just producers, but studio executives and actor agents and actors. And everybody is wanting this change and this change and this change and this change. So it's amazing. I think the iteration that finally got filmed is like the 6th or 7th, screenplay iteration that got done. And then budgets get involved. So there's certain things you can't do because of the budget and, all that. It's just crazy. I will say the really positive experience was that very early on, we talked about what I thought was the most essential part of the book. And I thought beyond the swim itself, which is, certainly important, it was the relationship she had with her sister, Trudy and her sister. And that's, front and center in the film. She didn't set out to become a feminist and change the world. She set out to see what she could do and to make her sister proud and to make her family proud. Very simple. She certainly became aware that this was a larger endeavor, but was not what she set out to do. So, I don't have any real issues with anything that got changed in the film. Yes, of course it would have been, you would love to have it precisely the way you wrote it. That's just
Sure.
not realistic. I tell people, hey, guess what? Oppenheimer never had those conversations with Einstein either. Those never happened.
No.
Right?
No.
Every biopic has to, every motion picture based on a true story has to make changes. It's inevitable. They're 2 different mediums. You just hope it's done, as I said, purposely. And I don't think anything was really changed, just cavalierly. Hey, let's change this. Let's put horns on somebody's head and make them a pink.
Yeah, she'll have 4 arms.
Yeah, it's not like that. So, and then I got really lucky. I was dealing with people who brought a lot of credibility to the table from the very beginning. And, they were incredibly kind to me. They brought me out to Bulgaria, where the movie was filmed for a week. I got to go to the premiere. Treated, very kindly and with respect. And I know that's not the case for a lot of authors who've had books turned into movies.
That's rare.
So I'm like, forever thankful. And it's certainly a nice thing to have happen when you're kind of getting out under the wire in this business.
Yep.
It's a good film. I mean, it'll be on Disney Plus soon. People really like it. It's a Disney movie, but people really like it. And the amazing thing is that it's in China right now. It's huge in China.
That's awesome.
There's a website where 30,000 viewers have rated it. Now, not everybody who goes and sees a movie rates it. So how many people have seen it? It's still in the theaters over there. For whatever reasons, and I'm not privy to Disney's thinking as to why they do things the way they do things. It's still in China.
That's very shocking, but also cool.
Yeah, weird.
I know alongside your editing and you do mentoring and you'll do reviews and help people with their book proposals, and you teach and that kind of stuff. Do you have a book about writing in you?
I've kind of thought about it, but I'd have to go through a lot of stuff I've already written to find it. I don't-
Yeah.
and then the other thing too, and you're probably going to laugh when you say this. I've never read a single book about writing. People
Never?
have, people have sent them to me. Um, I look at them. Here's how it works. I think anybody who writes about writing, and if you read a book that about writing that speaks to you, that's great. Everybody
Yep.
says the same damn stuff. You're just finding the metaphor that works for you. Okay. Um,
Yeah.
and nobody really says anything much different that I've found. I mean, I've looked at them, but I'm like, I can't read this. And the other thing is, I don't want to think about it too much. I don't want to
Yeah.
have this super head looking down over my shoulder telling me this is right or wrong because I read it in a book. And that's something else I always tell writers is, we self-sabotage ourselves a lot because we don't do something the way somebody else did. I self-sabotaged myself for years because I didn't think I wrote enough. And I'd read Jack Kerouac had written, a million words by the time he was 25. And by God, one day I sat down, I was 25. I've written a million words. Uh, not very good ones, but I'd written them. And or you don't sit down for 4 hours every day and produce 2,500 words on the nose. Find out how you work. I mean, you don't even want to see what the rest of this room looks like. It's a bloody mess. Works for me. I got another one in the basement that's even worse. Works for me. Find what works for you. And I don't know if I could put that in a book. I mean, I always tell everybody I used to work construction. I learned just as much about writing, working concrete and being a form carpenter and building warehouses as in any workshop I've ever been. And, I've taught workshops, but I've never really been in a workshop other than a poetry workshop. Uh, I do it intuitively and through experience. And, sometimes people think that works for them, so share what I know, use it or not.
Well, I think that is a great place to end it. I really appreciate you coming by and chatting with me. You can check out all of Glenn's stuff. Go to glennstout.com, find all of your books. Is there anything else you want to send people to while they're here?
Well, I'm on Twitter. I just got hacked on Facebook and Meta, so they took away my Instagram account. But I've got a website up for Young Woman in the Sea, or not a website, a group on Facebook for Young Woman in the Sea. I also have one for the year's best sports writing, which I'm trying to build back up because the old one got wiped out with like 1,000 members. So I'm trying to help triumph out with the next iteration on that. But no, that's about it. I'm easy to Google.
Yep. That's how I found you.
But hey, I want to thank you for this conversation. It's one of the best ones I've ever had talking about writing. I really enjoy that I've got to speak about all the stuff that I think is important, or most of the stuff I think is important anyway.
Thank you again to Glenn Stout for swinging by. It was a great conversation. There's a lot of stuff in there that I think I'm probably going to carry with me for a while. I've already said to my wife and to myself even, it's all knitting. The idea of just being there for every part of the process. It's all knitting. Also, I already looked up that Larry Bird story that Jeremy Collins wrote for Esquire, and there's a lot of other stuff that Collins has on there that I want to read on his website. So awesome recommendation from Glenn. Make sure you also check out Glenn's books, whether it's The Young Woman in the Sea or any of the other books that he has edited or consulted on. Best American Sports Writing, Best Sports Writing of the Year, or the Year's Best Sports Writing, I think it's actually called. They're all great. There's a lot of really, really memorable things for you to find, and reading widely is definitely something I recommend, like Glenn does. So thank you very much to him. And thank you to you for listening. If you appreciated the show or liked it at all, please leave a rating, a comment, tell other people about it, subscribe to it, all of those things. I have a lot more planned. And in fact, I'm recording another interview next week that I'm pretty excited about. So keep your eyes open for that one. I'll see you next time.